everyone. Welcome to another live stream on History Value Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Professor James H. Charlesworth, and today we're going to be discussing reasons for believing that Thomas is likely the beloved disciple. He also has a book on the subject titled The Beloved Disciple, whose witness validates the Gospel of John. I'll have the affiliate link in the description below and also in the pinned comment so you can go purchase the book.
And Jacob, in honor of you and your audience, if they write me for $50, I'll send them a copy, I'll sign it, and pay for the mailing.
Awesome. Thank you very much, James. I just want to ask you first about, can you give us a little brief summary about who Thomas is? For those that are not that much familiar with Thomas at all, can you tell us a little bit about him?
There are 12 disciples who have followed Jesus. One of the most interesting is Thomas. What we will be doing today is perceiving and critiquing what is in so many pulpits, so many universities, that Thomas is doubting Thomas. What I will try to do is to make it clear he is never shown doubting Jesus. He is the ideal disciple. He questions. He has criteria. He never doubts. He said, for me to believe, and he gives you criteria. Now that's a student. I will try to show you that during the Gospel of John, Thomas waits, appears, and then quietly observes, and then he asks questions. You will see that in the Gospel of John, Thomas makes it clear that he cannot believe the disciples until he has some experiences. Each of these claims and experiences are given to Thomas in the Gospel of John. So based upon his questioning and his criteria, I think we can say, because Thomas was critical, he asked, how do we know that? We also can say that Jesus is the Messiah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the similarities between Thomas and the beloved disciple? You've listed things that both Thomas and the beloved disciple were said to have done or said to have seen that shows Thomas to be connected to the beloved disciple in a unique way compared to how other individuals are to him.
The first point to make is that they never appear in the same pericope, in the same passage. So if they never appear together, they may be two different terms for the same disciple. I hope that makes sense. Now, when we work through it, you will see. Let us start with what scholars think. Too many of them say that Thomas is doubting Thomas, and that Thomas doubts that Jesus is alive again. This is a monstrous misinterpretation. It blindly passes on what was taught in the Dark Ages. It is now imperative to shine light on these dark passages. Only the Gospel of John can be involved because Thomas appears there and is the central disciple, which, if that makes sense, then why is he so central? Now, we have 5 problems that keep us from seeing that Thomas is the beloved disciple. Now, remember, beloved disciple is an abbreviation for the disciple who loved Jesus. And I'm going to try to show it is Thomas. The beloved disciple, there is no person named the beloved disciple in John. It is an abbreviation. Have scholars detected one of the 12 who is the beloved disciple? Secondly, scholars agreed that John is fundamentally a spiritual gospel, not primarily a historical record. I have been able to show with archaeologists and specialists that it's also full of historical details. And in many ways, the discovery of the Pool of Siloam and Bethzatha have shown that John knows more about Jerusalem and is more historical than anybody ever imagined. Doubting Thomas is a creation by specialists. There's no doubting Thomas. If we look through the Gospel of John, you'll find he asks questions. Now, asking questions is what a good student does. Doubting is a person who says, I doubt, I'm never going to believe. So, the disciple whom Jesus loved, this tradition precedes any gospel. Who is it? And it comes into only the Gospel of John. If it's so early, let's be open to the possibility it's historical. There was a man, a disciple of Jesus, one of the 12, called Thomas, who was considered the beloved disciple. Now, we're not going into the question of why he was called beloved. I'm afraid that's a totally different question, and it would take us into Syriac and to Eastern Europe. So we've made the point, it seems historical. Chapter 21, we now recognize is an addition to John, that John originally ended in chapter 20. So chapters 1 through 20 is what we should be looking at. Now, Thomas appears only once in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but he appears along with the beloved disciple 9 times. 9 times. Let's look at these. Let us study and review the mention of Thomas and the beloved disciple. After I read a passage, you can ask any question you want, if that makes sense. First, John 11:16. I'm going to read you the translation. Thomas, who was called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. Thomas is willing to die for Jesus. This is the first mention of Thomas. Unobservant commentators make these comments. Thomas has no idea what he's saying. The evangelist or the author of this section would be appalled at the stupidity of many who call themselves New Testament scholars. Is the fourth evangelist portraying Thomas as the ideal student of Jesus? I think so. He is willing to die with Jesus. I think all Christians would say, yes, I am willing to die for my Savior. When the fourth evangelist portrays Thomas as the ideal disciple of Jesus, he is one who is willing to die. Yet the commentators say how stupid he is. I think we should proceed. Now, not all scholars of John have come to this conclusion, though. And I'm trying to share with you, I'm a specialist on the Gospel of John, but I have become convinced he's the ideal disciple. He is willing, the first appearance, let us go die with him. Now, as you know, no disciple died with Jesus. But wait a minute. If Thomas was a little boy, he could be at the cross and not crucified. The Romans didn't crucify little boys. It would flame up resistance to Rome, and the Roman soldiers would be appalled. We don't want to crucify a little boy, and they don't crucify women. So when we get to the cross, we need to know the Roman law that will open our eyes to what's being said. Now, that's point one. Any comments at this point?
Not so far, James. Continue.
Okay. The second time, it is the beloved disciple. But now he is not called Thomas. It's in 13:23. After saying this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and declared, "Very truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me." The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he was speaking. One of his disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. That means he's very close to Jesus in power and respect. So, reclining next to Jesus, he asked him, Simon Peter therefore mentioned to him, ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. Please, you who were loved by Jesus, ask him who is speaking. So while reclining next to Jesus, he asked him, Lord, who is it? Jesus answered, it is the one to whom I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish. So when he had dipped the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. After he received the piece of bread, Satan entered into him, and Jesus said to him, do quickly what you are going to do. So when they ask who is going to betray him, it is the beloved disciple that gets the answer. So BD is superior. The beloved disciple is superior to Peter, who must ask him for information. So one of the disciples whom Jesus loved, or the beloved disciple, is now introduced as superior. He can't be doubting Thomas. He's got to be believing Thomas. But if we stay tuned, we'll find out what are his criteria and how does he know that? Are you ready for the third?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's in John 14. Jesus says, and you know the way to the place where I am going. Thomas asked him, Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way? Jesus said to Thomas, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one can come to the Father except through me. After listening and thinking, this is an ideal disciple who's listened and thought. Thomas asked the key question in John. He is given the full answer. No other disciple is so astute as Thomas. Thomas alone asks, Lord, we do not know where you are going. How may we know the way? Or how can we know the way? Are you ready to go deeper into John?
Yep.
Number 4. As I've said, the beloved disciple is never mentioned with Thomas. The best explanation is they are different names for the same. That is, Thomas is the beloved disciple. In 1926, we read of the disciple whom he loved, and this the last time the beloved disciple is mentioned in the early edition of John. Let us read it. Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother. Jesus is dying and his mother's there. And his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, Woman, here is your son. Then he said to the disciple, Here is your mother. And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. The beloved disciple is the only male at the crucifixion. All the others have gone hiding. They're afraid. I don't want to be crucified. Most likely, Thomas is very young. Thus, the Romans would not crucify him. So now, this is very interesting. As I study John, Thomas, as the beloved disciple, sees Jesus die. And that becomes important when he lays out the criteria. Only he is the male, the disciple, who saw how Jesus was crucified. Let's go to 5, 6, and 7, because now we're getting hot. In chapter 20, Thomas appears, and there's no more mention of the beloved disciple. Now, this is also the passage in which scholars have found doubting Thomas. They created it. It's not to be found. That adjective, doubting, does not appear connected with Thomas. Rather note, before I read the passage, that Thomas is the ideal student. He does not believe because of the disciples' faith. He is not doubting. Thomas is honest, inquisitive. He demands criteria as a good student. And that proves he had seen Jesus die and a spear enter his side. Recall the Gospel of John and why Thomas must have seen how Jesus died and why he was not present when Jesus appeared to the 10. The 10, because Thomas isn't there, and because Judas is gone. So your 12 are down to 10. Let us read the passage. It's John chapter 20. But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. Now, why wasn't he there? He was at the crucifixion, and he was there polluted. He could not appear for a week. For a week, he had to purify himself. So he's not only the ideal disciple, but he is also a faithful Jew that realizes he must not be present until he's been purified. And that takes him one whole week. Now, if you listen carefully, he appears, but he wasn't there earlier. But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. And you know why. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his wrists, and put my finger in the mark of the nails, and my hand in his side, I will not believe." He's got criteria. He knows how Jesus died. No other male did. Women cannot be witnesses. We all know that according to Judaism at this time. A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. He's now been purified. And it says a week later. The author assumes everyone knows the Jewish laws. This is for Jews and clearly for us. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, remember, the resurrected Jesus can pass in between doors. He can disappear. That's a whole new, different question. What was the resurrected body of Jesus like that he can come into doors? Isn't this amazing? What do we know about the resurrected body? And it is clear God raised Jesus. Too many Christians think he rose again. Well, that means he didn't die. He died. He screams on the cross, "Where are you, Lord? Why have you forsaken me?" He's dead. Too many Christians don't want him to die. If he doesn't die, he can't be resurrected. God resurrected him, I think, only a few hours after he died, not Sunday morning. That's when the women could see the tomb is empty. How did the tomb become empty? Boy, we have so many questions. But the empty tomb was never a belief for his resurrection. The tomb was empty. Fine, we all agree. But that's not proof of anything. Scholars get confused. Pastors get confused. The tomb is empty. But according to John, it is God that raised his son. A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you. Shalom lecha. Shalom lechem." Today, it's said everywhere, shalom, shalom, peace. It's like saying hi, but it's much deeper meaning. And we hear it 2,000 years ago. Peace be with you, shalom lechem. Peace, shalom means peace. Then he said to Thomas, "Thomas, put your finger here and see my hands and my wrist. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." There you get the idea of doubting. Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." Do not doubt, but believe. That's the RSV station. Often doubt is no longer attributed to Thomas. Actually, the Greek doesn't say doubt. It says kaimeganu apistos, ala pistos. Be no longer faithful, but faithful. That's exactly what the Greek says. The King James Version is more accurate. Do not be unbelieving, but believing. The King James has got it right. Don't be faithless any longer. Believe. That's the New Living Translation. Much better, be not faithless, but faithful. There's no doubting. No doubting. Well, as we continue, in chapter 21, he appears as the twin. Now, let me see if I can wrap this up. I'm so pleased people have seen that the King James Version got it right. Be no longer unbelieving, but believing. There's no doubting. Who came up with that idea? Thomas never doubted. He says, "Gentlemen, I can't believe until I have observed what I saw happen on the cross. I've got to touch where the nails were. I've got to put my hand where the spear was." Well, wait a minute. How does he know that? The beloved disciple saw it, and he wasn't crucified because he was a little boy. Now, what have we got as our conclusions? Thomas and the beloved disciple never appear in the same scene, and that makes us wonder, could they be the same one? Yes, they are most likely two names for the same person. Thomas is the hero in the concluding chapter of John. He makes the consummate confession in the most theological and true gospel. He offers the final confession, "My Lord and my God." In chapter 20, Thomas is the one who is a disciple whom Jesus loved, and Thomas is the hero. Why is this missing? because people came up with the idea of doubting Thomas. Why is it missed? Because doubting Thomas was canonized. There's no doubting Thomas. Why was it missed? He does not believe because others believe. He believes because he experienced the crucifixion as the beloved disciple. And he makes the culminating confession, my Lord, my God. We may also believe because of the questions and the request and the criteria of Jesus' beloved disciple. He is the ideal student. Notice how he watches. He listens. He observes. And then he asks the key question. The answer proves that the resurrected Lord and indeed is the crucified Jesus. Jesus is portrayed as one who loved the disciple that questions him and learned from the great teacher. I'm sure there are lots of questions. Obviously, I have lots of questions, but there is absolutely no question to me that Thomas is the beloved disciple, and my foundation is based upon his ability to question and not just to easily believe. Thank you, Jacob.
Thank you, James. Can you tell us a bit about the links between the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of John? And does the Gospel of Thomas help provide additional information that links Thomas to the beloved disciple?
Well, we're shifting now from the Gospel of John to the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of John evolved over maybe 100 years, but it has the earliest passages that even go back to Jesus. Now, the Gospel of Thomas was dated around 200, but recently scholars have said around 100, maybe before, maybe after. And it's very interesting. It wasn't known until it was discovered recently in Egypt. I mean, recently in the last 100 or so years. It wasn't there to be known. Now, the Gospel of Thomas is very complex. First of all, it is a saying source. It's sayings of Jesus. That is our earliest gospel. We call it the Lost Gospel, or Q, the Q Gospel used by Matthew and Luke. It's a saying source. Both of them quoted. How do we explain that a quotation of Jesus appears in Matthew and Luke? Because they both used a similar source. Now, when we look at Thomas, it's a saying source. Why didn't it become powerful? Because sayings without the body, the life of a man, are not going to be persuasive. It's Jesus's life, his willing to die, his crucifixion, his resurrection. These are not sayings. These are part of his life. So I think everybody can understand why the Gospel of Thomas begins to disappear. A sayings gospel, that is the sayings gospel, Q, was used by Matthew and Luke, and once it disappeared, because believers need more than sayings. I hope that's helpful, Jacob.
It is, but I'm all with the other part of the question I was also asking about is: are there links between the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of John? Do they have some things in common?
Yeah, but we have a lot of other gospels. We have the infancy gospel of Thomas. We have the Acts of Thomas. Now, the Gospel of Thomas has 114 sayings of Jesus, parables and sayings of Jesus, as I said, like the lost Q used by Matthew and Luke. Now, it's extant only in one Coptic manuscript, and it was found in 1945 in Nag Hammadi, which is in Upper Egypt. Greek fragments were found earlier at Oxyrhynchus, Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 1, 654 and 655. The early Coptic manuscripts dates to about 340. But the Gospel of Thomas is very early. According to my research, over the last 50 years, I think the Gospel of Thomas dates to the very beginning of the 2nd century and may have traditions that go earlier. There are so many parallels that we really can't get into them. Let me give you an example. In the Gospel of Thomas, we have entahe, in my way. Now, in the canonical Gospels, you cannot become my disciple unless you hate your father and mother. Well, I don't think I'm going to follow that man. But the Gospel of Thomas says, you cannot become my disciple unless you hate your father and mother in tahe, the way I did, which means he never hated his father and mother, not in my way. So why we have now two options. Either Thomas correctly interprets Jesus, or Matthew and Luke do. I don't think Matthew and Luke has caught, and somehow the tradition they pass on has lost in my way. You must follow me in my way. I hope that's helpful. You're throwing me some difficult issues. I'm happy.
Why did the ancient church fathers believe that John the Apostle was the beloved disciple?
It's a long tradition. I think it predates any gospel. It goes back to period before 70. Also, they knew the Gospel of John. I think we can say the Gospel of John was the most powerful and influential of all the Gospels. If you look at the Diatessaron, how Tatian has woven together all 6 Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas, the 4 Gospels, and maybe some other Gospels. I spent a large part of my youth looking at the Diatessaron. It is not Diatessaron through 4. It is Evangelion de Mahalata, the mixed Gospel, mixing together all the early Gospels. And we all know many Gospels were lost. And no one I know says it's good they were lost. Why were 4 Gospels picked? We were told by the early followers of the church, we need 4 Gospels breathing out eternal life and breath of life, because there are 4 winds, the north, the south, the east, and the west. Most of us see that as an explanation of why 4 was used, and not an explanation why 4 should be used. In fact, we know that in Greece, long before Jesus, there was a building that showed that there were 8 winds. So you can't say that everyone knew there were only 4 winds. Today, we talk about the southwest wind, the northeast wind. So you don't come up with the idea there are only 4 winds, therefore we need 4 Gospels. I think we need every Gospel that breathes to us the power of God that is channeled through Jesus. I'm hoping that what I'm saying makes sense, Jacob. I know I'm spinning very challenging ideas. I think it was wise to choose 4 Gospels, but I doubt that people read only 4 Gospels. and say, this is my gospel. I read 4 gospels, and for me, the Gospel of John is the one that speaks to my heart. But I also like to look at all the gospels we now have in Syriac and Coptic and Greek and Latin and open our eyes. We're living in a different time when we demand more information. The Dead Sea Scrolls showed us how wrong scholars were. So let's continue to ask questions, because we should be open. The more questions we ask, the more mature we are, and the more we begin to realize, gee, I didn't know that.
Does the multi-compositional stages of the composition of John affect the way that the beloved disciple is developed in the story? And for instance, the addition of John chapter 21 to the gospel, does that affect how the rest of the text discuss the beloved disciple?
That's a very good question. I've never heard it asked, and the answer is no. That these references to Thomas and the beloved disciple are not in additions within the Gospel of John. They are in the expansion of John, which I made clear is chapter 21. So what we really do have is the earliest passages in John talk about the beloved disciple and Thomas, not the interpolated ones, which would be maybe 15 through 17 and chapter 1 through 18. The expansion of John has no effect on what I've been sharing today. And Jacob, wow, you asked major questions. I don't think anybody's ever asked that.
Well, I'm glad I did not realize that. What other major similarities persuaded you that Thomas is a beloved disciple that you haven't mentioned yet?
Since I published my book on the beloved disciple, and remember, I wrote that asking, I don't know who is the beloved disciple. I was shocked that some people thought it was Judas. I couldn't imagine that. There are other people that conclude it's John, but we don't know the name of the 4th gospel. These names were like Matthew and Mark and Luke and John. When were they added? Our earliest tradition, they don't have a name. Some of them do in papyri, but not in all. So when were the names given and why? Now, some people say the beloved disciple has to be John because John is the name of the Gospel of John. I just pointed out that we don't know the early name of the Gospel of John. So that's not helpful.
So we have a super chat question. Johansson, thank you for your super chat. Is it possible Judas Thomas could be Jesus' son rather than his brother?
Well, we're getting into a lot of these questions. There are early traditions that claim Jesus had a son, and that Mary left at the crucifixion and the problems, and she took her son to Spain or to France. There are lots of these traditions. If Jesus is close to Mary Magdalene, some people think they were married. And they argue that every male must obey, be fruitful, and multiply. I would not think any less of Jesus if he had loved Mary Magdalene and had a son. I really don't have evidence of that. I don't have evidence that disproves it. I would say it doesn't help. The one thing that drove Christianity and made it successful is the proclamation in the fulfillment of time God sent his son Jesus into the world to save the world. So being married has nothing to do with that. There are lots of things I'm exploring. Did, for example, Paul go to Spain to convert Pilate? We know that Pilate was the head of the Roman Empire from 26 to 36 in Palestine, and that 36 he was thrown out. Well, where was he sent? He was a very high official. The tradition says he was sent to Spain, as far away as possible from Rome. That is where the Roman fleet was. Now, Paul says, I'm on my way to Spain. Why? Now, when you read the tradition, Pilate is not a bad guy. He asked Jesus, what is truth? He makes a claim, I can find no fault in this man. We have thrown stones, all of us, at Pilate, but there are traditions. Maybe he was pondering if he came close to Jesus and he stood there and asked him, and there was no fear in Jesus. Wouldn't that impress Pilate? Did Pilate eventually become a believer? We have the Gospel of Pilate. People say, how do you know this? Well, that's my job. But can you help me find history in Pilate? I don't know. I'm a critic. I don't believe there's history in traditions until I'm convinced. Am I convinced there's history in Pilate stories? Yes, but where? Where? And I'm very curious. Peter, you're on your way to Spain. Why? I think it's because he wants to convert Pilate. He comes back and dies in Rome. Now we're about to hear another program. It's going to appear next year, in which the television program claims that Peter comes back to Jerusalem. We'll have to wait and see. I haven't seen the program, but I'm informed about it. Jacob, the more we ask questions, the more we have questions that help us understand how little we know. Remember, the Gospels were collected to convert belief, not to teach you history. I think we have a tremendous amount of history. It used to be, let's say 200 years ago, the Gospels were just full of fables. There was no Jesus. Can you believe that? We have come a long way. We know Jesus existed. We have found a tremendous amount of history in the Gospels. The Gospels are not only proclamations, they are telling us history that we have come to believe is highly reliable. Now, remember, by people who ask questions and don't start with faith. I think I'm a person that asks a lot of questions, and that makes my faith even stronger.
Did any of the ancient Christians recognize that Thomas was a beloved disciple or hinted that he was?
I think the author of John, whoever he was, is telling us that the beloved disciple is Thomas. I think in the early Syriac traditions, but they're in Edessa, they're to the east. You see, Christianity became successful in the east and the west, but we in the west, because Greece and Rome was so powerful, and we are in the west. If you go to the east, you'll find so much more about Thomas. The tradition is that he went to the east and he took Christianity to India. But now you see, we need to learn from those in the east because we're in the west. And you're even farther west than I am. You're in Texas. We have to, what am I saying? let's realize that we're shaped by Western traditions of the gospel. And that's where Christianity became powerful. Rome, London, and the United States.
We have another super chat question. Lauren Jones, thank you for your super chat. Church traditions of India tell that Thomas reached Kerala and established churches in 52 AD. Do you know where they got this date?
Well, Lauren is very brilliant. I am not one that is suspicious about the traditions in India. I have spent a lot of my time. I've always wanted to go to India. I haven't. I understand Lauren Johns has gone to India. He may have information I don't. Early on in my training, I got very interested in India and took courses on India. And I read the Upanishads, and I got very influenced. Tat Tvam Asi, which is in the great Indian tradition. Who are you? And so Udalaka was training his son, Svetaketu. And Svetaketu asked Udalaka, what am I? And Udalaka took an acorn and he ground it. Tat Tvam Asi, that art thou. Now, that's not far from Christianity, that God bent down and blew and created the human Adam. I'm not ignoring the question. Maybe Lauren Johns knows a little bit more than I do, but Thomas traditions are in the south west section of India, and I've always wanted to go there and study Thomas traditions. How did Thomas traditions get so rich in India? I think maybe it's because of the truth in the early tradition that Thomas took the gospel there. Now, the gospel means the good news, not necessarily a text. He took the good news that God remembered, and he sent his son into the world to save the world. And the Thomas Christians, I have taught some of them. They've come to me at Duke and come to me at Princeton, and obviously they are not critical of their traditions, but maybe we Westerners are too critical of our traditions. But that's how I was trained, not to believe traditions until you really study them and get to learn them. Thank you for the question.
Why was Thomas later understood to be the doubter? Why did they interpret him that way, despite the fact the Gospel of John is trying to imply that he's a beloved disciple, that he came around to believe? Why was he yet called the doubting Thomas? Why was he given that negative?
Because of some bad translations that said that Thomas doubted. It's not an accurate translation. Even the KJV has given us a wonderful translation. Be no longer disbelieving, but believe. And that is what I'm trying to say. Don't disbelieve because you haven't even thought about it, but move from disbelief to belief. And there's no doubt in that, except all of us begin by doubting everything, hopefully. And that helps us to begin to say, I no longer disbelieve, I believe.
Is there anyone else in any of the other arguments that's made for the identity of the beloved disciple that also is claimed to have not appeared in any of the same scenes as the beloved disciple? Or does only Thomas bear that in common?
I would like to know what Judas believed. Does he believe? You have two portrayals of Judas. One is Jesus is a fake, and he wants him to be accounted for, and he was willing to sell his master. I see no evidence of any of that. Do what must do quickly is what we hear Jesus' last statement to Judas. What does Judas do? He leads a group of soldiers from the high priest to where Jesus prays in the Garden of Gethsemane. He kisses Jesus. Maybe some of this is added. And he brings Jesus back. In the back of his mind, I have no doubt he's expecting Annas to be present. But when he walks into the high priest's house, Caiaphas has already gone to the temple. And a man who is interested in peace above truth, he questions Jesus. Annas has survived for decades because he compromised. Now, compromise can be good, but not when you compromise truth, goodness, and an individual. Thomas is a faithful disciple. Maybe Judas was too. Maybe Judas wanted Jesus to face Caiaphas, not Annas. And maybe that's why a good plan backfired. What you have to do is explain, why does Thomas hang himself? On that same day, outside the walls of Jerusalem, two men representing Jesus' group died, both on a tree. Jesus on the cross and Judas hanging from a living tree. Now, in my mind, I thought that Jesus was very high, way above. Golgotha was very high. And then on the top of Golgotha, you have a cross. And on the top of that cross, could Jesus see? I want this finger up and this one down. Good. From the top of Golgotha, Jesus may have been able to see over the wall. And maybe it's imagination, it's speculation, but let us not hold our imagination back. Jesus from the top of the cross maybe could see Judas hanging himself in the valley. I'm not saying this happened. I'm wondering. I can wonder about things that are totally absurd and maybe things that really happened. Why did Judas hang himself? Something went wrong. I'm not against Judas. Did he try to force the hand of God? If so, that is wrong. Oh, we would like to rewrite history so there's no Holocaust, so there's no Nazis. But we can't. There's been terrible suffering. And Jesus was the most authentic Jew I've ever met. And he died screaming, my God, Eli, Eli, lama, or if you prefer the Aramaic, Eloi, Eloi, lama. Why? I hope we can all start and say, let's start with the confession. Why, God? Why? And maybe that puts our feet deep in reality. To me, reality is also that the tomb was empty, not because of robbers, but because of a miracle. If you don't believe in miracles, you don't know what's going on all around you. I hope I'm making sense.
Yeah, can you talk about the K. Hanhart's argument that Paul the Apostle is the beloved disciple of the Gospel of John?
Well, I would
Why do
simply
you some
say
believe that?
I don't see any evidence of that. Paul was not there as a disciple, but I agree he was at the trial. And I think that's the thorn in the flesh. Remember, he is standing collecting garments while Stephen is being stoned. He's involved. He's on his way up to Damascus. He's going to get those nasty people who think that Jesus could be the Son of God, those idiots who think he's the Messiah. And then the bright light. And he doesn't have to interpret. He knew who has appeared to him. And that's why he could go throughout the world and shipwreck after shipwreck, stoning after stoning, fighting in Ephesus against wild beasts. I have argued he was a great athlete. He was like the great gladiator, if you prefer that. He fought in Ephesus wild beasts, and he killed the wild beast. You're not looking at a weak man. You're looking at Paul, the apostle. Nothing could stop him. Why did he keep coming? Because he had been awakened by a bright light. And maybe, as I was suggesting, the thorn in the flesh is his hatred of Jesus that just would keep him awake at night. Eventually, of course, seeing the bright light. If you see a bright light and it's Jesus, you don't believe, you instantaneously confess, my Lord, my God. And that empowered him. That was his ready ever battery, if you will. Nothing could stop him.
And in my closing question, can you give a couple of examples of what you say, of what you would say is the most powerful evidence that Thomas is a beloved disciple?
The whole narrative of John. He appears saying he's willing to die. And the commentators, he has no idea what he's talking about. Wait a minute. The Gospel of John says he's willing to die. Why do you reject that? I think you shouldn't just throw stones at your traditions. You should stay it. Maybe he is one who's willing to die. So that would be the ideal disciple. I am willing to die for my faith. Now, if you're not willing to die for your faith, then you're not able to accept what your faith gives you. Then he continues on. He observes. He's very quiet. The narrative develops. He observes. Then he's young. He's at the cross. He's observing. None of us, Jacob, you can't, I can't imagine that horror. A man so mutilated, and then a spear is put into his side. Oh my gosh. Now, Pilate was astounded at beginning at 9 a.m. and dying at 3. He's on the cross for such a short time. We know from Josephus, some people stayed on the cross for 2 days. Sorry, it's hard for me to say it. 2 weeks, and then died or survived. They were on a cross for 2 weeks, but now this gets so complicated. You have the high crucifixion, you have the low crucifixion, you have the crucifixion with ropes, you have the crucifixion with nails. So if you put a man on a cross and wrap him with ropes, that is the worst crucifixion. How long will that take? And maybe people who pass on give him water, which it prolongs his suffering. All right, so we have to realize there's more than 1 or 2 or 3 or even 10 methods of crucifying someone. And he's at the cross. The beloved disciple sees the horror, and he has to go home for a week to purify himself. Is that because the blood hit him? I don't know. But he was there, and he was near death. I think the beloved disciple must have helped bury Jesus. That would make it clear. That's why Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus cannot worship the Passover. They must go home. They have touched the blood of a dead man. You cannot worship for 7 days. And on the beginning of the second week, Thomas was present. Bingo, bingo. It all makes sense, the whole narrative. And then the confession is so moving. Ho kurios mu, ho theos mu, my Lord. Ho theos mu kai ho kurios mu, my Lord and my God. I want to say thank you, Jacob. Gives me a chance to say that I don't start with my faith, but I certainly end up with a much stronger faith because I was taught to question and to explore and to wonder. And you're helping us do that, Jacob.
Well, thank you very much, James. Can you tell the audience real quick where they can contact you so they can get the signed copy of your book?
You can write me at 51 Ross Stevenson, Stevenson, Ross 51 Ross Stevenson Circle, Princeton, 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 New Jersey 08540, and send a check for $50 and I'll send it to my foundation. And then the gift I'll give to you is a copy of The Beloved Disciple, which I'll sign and mail to you. Jacob, you also have my address. So if they don't know if they didn't have time to write that down, they can contact you. And why don't you give them your phone number so they could, call you? But I want you to get the book if you want it. And it asks the question, and it gives you even the chapter why all the people that are thought to be the beloved disciple, including John, which is a very powerful argument, except we do not know the name of the Gospel of John, and John doesn't appear in it either.
Well, before we close, there is one more person that managed to get in a couple of super chats. I fished in a tie. Thank you for your super chat. Are there any thoughts of who Thomas is, since Thomas means twin?
I've spent a lot of time on that. I don't know. Where does that come from? Where does the concept of twin come from? I'm sorry. I've tried to figure it out. And I'm sure you have a lot of books. You can go to the library. You can go on the internet. That's more helpful than I can give you. I've come up with it's Eastern. And where does it come from? Is it historical or is it mythological? That is not literally fleshly a twin, but a twin witness. As Jesus witnesses in John, so the twin witnesses.
And he's giving us one more. He's giving me one more super chat. I fished in a tie. Thank you for that. Dr. Charlesworth, you are a great inspiration to me and many others. God bless you.
Thank you, and God bless each of you.
Well, thank you for joining me today, James.
You're most welcome. I think you got some real good stuff from me, and I hope we didn't use dogma too much.
Well, let me go ahead and close the stream.
All right.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.